Hello, welcome to our discussion of the Google case. Hopefully by now you have read the case, reflected on the questions that we provided, and had some opportunity to discuss those questions with others either in forums or in person. My intent here with these case debrief is not to give you the answers to the questions, but rather to provide some things to think about as you do these various analyses or respond to these different questions. It's often the case that there is not a right or wrong answer to the questions that we raise. The purpose here is to highlight that there are, though, often better argued questions than others, better argued answers than others. And so I'm going to provide you some guidance here to think about these tools and frameworks and how they might be applied even more generally than the specific case here of Google. My hope through all this is to illustrate you how to really think about doing a strategic analysis, how to leverage some of these tools to provide insights here. And so this is an opportunity for you to apply these tools and basically hone your strategic analysis capability. So let's jump right in. The first question we ask is, what is Google's strategy? Now, on the surface, this seems like a pretty straightforward, simple question here. Once again, I would suggest you think about the three parts of strategy we talked about in the first module, which is what's the mission of the organization, what's their strategic plan, or what we might call strategic intent, and then finally, what are specific strategic actions they are taking in line with those. Together, those three help define their strategy. Now, in Google's case, you can go online, look at their annual report, look at their website, and get some information about how they articulate their strategy. And I'm going to highlight two things that they highlight in their own statements. First is what might be thought of as a value statement, to do no evil. Well, that's a really catchy and interesting way to frame their values, and one to think about, how do you actually operationalize that at the end of the day. The second thing I'd highlight is what I'd call, might call their mission statement, which espouses this idea of organizing the world's information. And as we've discussed before, it's a very broad and grandiose mission, but what does that mean at the end of the day? I think it's really interesting to note with Google that as you start to unpack these very high aspirations, the fact of the matter is over 90% of their revenues still come from paid online search. And predominantly, historically, that's meant from personal computers. Of course, mobile is becoming more important. But once again, their primary business model is to sell you advertising through the search process. So an interesting question for us is, how can we break this down further? How can we go a little bit deeper in our understanding of who Google is and how they're achieving their objectives and what their strategic plan is? So let's discuss the competitor analysis, one of the other requests we had of you as you considered the case. The question of what is their industry and who are their competitors, again, might seem deceptively simple on the surface, but actually can be quite difficult. Let me quote one student here who has a great way of perspective on this. It is easy to identify Google's competitors because all the technological companies are actually competitors of Google. But to decide which are the most important ones is really difficult. And I think that's a great insight there. One of the interesting things in Google's space is suddenly all of these companies that maybe historically were thought of somewhat distinct, Microsoft or Apple, others as well, are suddenly competing with one another in different interesting ways. In general, when you're trying to identify the competition and identify the industry, recognize there's a number of things that can make this challenging. One thing to think about, simple product differentiation. So I've mentioned before Porsche and Kia and the comparison between the two. While they're both in the auto sector, are they really competing with one another that closely? In Google's case, it's interesting to think about Yahoo. Clearly historically a major competitor for Google, but are they such today that they should be the one we put a lot of our attention on if we're doing a competitor analysis? Another thing that might lead to some challenges with identification is geographic segmentation. Think about the wireless carrier business, the cellular business. That tends to be very regional, if not nation-state based, where you have these national carriers. As a result, it's probably not useful for you if you're considering, let's say, a European-based telecom to think and worry about the US-based telecoms, to the extent there is even some political legal reasons that those are separate industries and separate companies. In the search business, it's interesting to think about Baidu in search in China. One of the few places that Google does not have an overwhelming market share is China. They have this entrenched rival in Baidu. And while Google has made some inroads there, there's clearly they're a second place finisher to Baidu. How much do we need to consider them? Do we need to consider this Chinese market on the same level as other markets? These are all kind of interesting open questions if you're doing a competitor analysis on Google. More generally, we might think about close substitutes. Think about soft drinks versus sport drinks. To what extent is Gatorade versus Pepsi or the like in competition with one another? Those can be important questions to ask when thinking about the competition. Industries clearly evolve. If we look at someone like IBM, historically we'd probably define them as a macro computer, mini computer manufacturer, then a personal computer manufacturer. Today we probably would refer to them as more of a service-based company. And once again, clearly in Google's space, there's been a lot of coalescing amongst the various players within the technology space. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, we might not have seen a Google and Apple in competition or a Facebook. Now they're increasingly so. Even Amazon, we might importantly put in that set of competitors Google needs to think about. Last but not least, we might think about different technologies. We've talked about Nucor steel before, large steel mills versus mini mills as a potential source of difference within that industry. While both types of companies produce steel, they have different underlying technologies at the end of the day, and that might be a difference. So how do you do this? How do you actually define the industry and determine who the competitors are? I would say the gold standard is what we call cross-price elasticity. And what this simply means is if you raise the price of one good or service, what happens to the demand of another? So classic example would be butter and margarine. If you raise the price of butter, arguably demand for margarine would increase as people substitute away from the higher priced butter to the margarine. So if we can measure that, we can actually get some of these trade-offs and really see, oh yes, these two companies are actually competing with one another because of this price sensitivity between their products or services. In fact, there's a lot of new data that's being collected in kind of the big data sense, maybe point of sale data, credit card data and the like, that allows you to do maybe more refined tests to determine that cross-price elasticity. At the end of the day, though, it's often difficult to get exactly the data you need to make these distinctions. So I suggest a simpler strategy, which is just to identify what we would call strategic groups. Bundles of companies that have similar backgrounds, and then prioritize them based on the ones that are most relevant and most closely related. So when I think of Google, the most obvious direct competitor to their search business would probably be somebody like Microsoft and Bing. But as we think more broadly, as they move further in their technology development, there's clearly others we want to have a high priority on and to be thinking about. All right, let's move on to our second tool that we asked you to complete here. That's an environmental analysis. I think you can identify any number of important environmental factors in Google's world across the 6 categories we outline. One could imagine even looking at political legal challenges Google faces in different environments, issues around censorship and privacy. So even a tech company like Google faces significant pressures from a number of different quadrants. In general, I would suggest don't worry about getting things classified into the right category in your environmental analysis. That's not really important and critical at the end of the day. The main reason we have these 6 categories is just to fire in your brain different things you need to be thinking about. And so as long as you list those out, it doesn't matter if you get it into one category or another. It's really to get your thinking clear on these issues. Another thing I would observe is that just recognize that for certain companies and certain industries, different categories are going to matter more than others. So clearly in Google, technology is a huge issue. For other industries, maybe the fashion industry, like maybe that's less of an issue compared to like social cultural trends or demographic trends. So don't worry if there's certain topics that don't elicit a lot of ideas or a lot of trends. Again, that's going to vary quite a bit across different industries and companies you look at. Once we have these 2 tools completed, we now ask our question about, is this a competitive market? Is this one of these perfectly competitive markets where economic rents are hard to come by? Or is this an industry and a firm that might have a sustained competitive advantage in some way? This is in essence the heart of what we're trying to achieve in our Foundations of Business Strategy course, and will be a subject for many of the modules we talk about within this course. We'll talk in later modules about capabilities analysis as a way to analyze internally what are those capabilities the firm has, and do they provide a sustained competitive advantage. In Google's case, a number of things might come to mind. We might cite the user interface, the simplicity of it that many people enjoy. But what you want to think about again are these issues around imitability. How hard is it for someone to imitate that user interface of Google? In fact, it's very easy, and many others have. If you look at Bing and Yahoo and some others, they will have these simple interfaces that are available to you if you choose. So that becomes harder to identify as a source of sustained competitive advantage, likely because of its ease of imitability. How about technology? Maybe the underlying search technology is simply superior for Google. Maybe not. Let me give you a quote here from Microsoft Bing's VP of Development. Google's a very nice system, but compared to my vision, it's pathetic. All right, so they're not known for being modest there, perhaps, but an interesting perspective of whether or not the technology itself is really the distinctive advantage for Google. How about its brand? Right? It's become this verb these days. You Google something. Students often like to cite this as the potential source of competitive advantage. Once again, perhaps, but let's think of some things. One, about only 8% of revenues from Google go to advertising. So they're not spending a lot on this brand. I would also point out that over the history of search, we've had lots of different market leaders. You might, of course, remember Yahoo. How about Alta Vista, Lycos? All of these kind of historical examples of search. And at the time, they were popular brands that have fallen by the wayside. I'm not suggesting, again, that that's going to happen to Google, but it makes us question whether the Google's brand is really the heart of its advantage. As we've talked before, really it's these higher order combinations of capabilities that often lead to competitive advantage. Here's a quote from a student who says, "People are what really matter nowadays. They are what define if the company will succeed or not." I think that's an interesting perspective here. It gets us to these kind of higher order issues around capabilities and the like, and around things like the integration of those in terms of culture, that maybe that's the secret sauce for Google at the end of the day. So last but not least, we asked the question, would you invest in Google? So to be clear, this is not a question of whether Google is likely to be successful. It is really a question about whether the market currently overvalues or undervalues Google as a company. So they might be successful moving into the future, but if they're overvalued in the market, they may be a bad investment opportunity. Now, theoretically, the market value of Google should be equal to the stream of future discounted cash flows that accrue to the company. Now, it's beyond our scope to go through a discounted cash flow analysis. However, if you make a model and look at the numbers, I think one thing that becomes clear very quickly is that the current market valuation of Google suggests that they're going to have to grow their revenues quite substantially over the next, let's say, 5-10 years. It also suggests, if you consider looking at their current dominance in search, the fact that they have 70%, if not more, in certain markets in terms of their search capabilities. If you consider that the market for search itself, while still growing, is beginning to taper off in terms of that growth. It suggests to me that the only way they could justify their stock price is that they're going to have to diversify their earnings into some other line of business. Now, for Google, we could speculate what that might be. They're making investments in things like driverless vehicles and the like. Maybe there's an opportunity for them to monetize some of these other efforts that they have. But right now, again, they are primarily an advertisement company selling advertisement through search. So again, doing the analysis, looking at the numbers, we can start to speculate how they might leverage their current capabilities, current competitive advantages, to then diversify into other businesses if we think they're a good investment opportunity. All right, so in summary, let me end with the following. I hope you're beginning to see how these tools that we've developed can be applied in a business context here to start painting a picture of the company and its competitive environment. Competitor analysis and environmental analysis, two fundamental tools here to help us understand that competitive environment. We're going to add more as we go here. These all work in concert with one another. They're not viewed as isolated analyses here. They complement one another to create a fuller picture of a comprehensive strategic analysis. So again, they start to help us answer some important questions about the strategy and direction of the firm and give us a template for working through what are really kind of quite complex questions at the end of the day.